was about to find out. Picture the quietest kind of Friday morning you can imagine. The kind where the light comes in slow through thin curtains, where the city outside is just beginning to wake up, and where a woman sits at a kitchen table in a small apartment in Columbia, South Carolina, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that has already gone cold. She is 34 years old. She is 7 months pregnant. And 2 days ago, the man she married walked out of that apartment with a suitcase, his wedding ring left on the bathroom counter like a tip at a diner, and every dollar from their shared bank account transferred quietly into an account she did not know existed. She has $47. She has a baby coming in 8 weeks. And she has no idea, not even the faintest shadow of an idea, that 3 weeks earlier, yet one of the most significant private estates in modern American history was left entirely and solely in her name. Her name is Claire Whitfield. And what happened to her in the space of 4 months, beginning with the worst morning of her life and ending with something so extraordinary that even the attorneys involved said they had never seen anything quite like it, is the kind of story that stays with you. Not because of the money, though the money is staggering. Not because of the betrayal, though the betrayal cuts deep. But because of what Claire did when the world handed her both at the same time. And because of the woman who made sure that, no matter what happened, her granddaughter would never be left with nothing. But before we get there, you need to understand what Marcus Webb took from her, and why the thing he never counted on was the one thing that changed everything. This is the story of Claire Whitfield, a woman who went from abandoned and broke, and 7 months pregnant in a cold apartment with $47 to her name, to one of the wealthiest private heirs in American history. Overnight, without warning, and without anyone, not even Claire herself, seeing it coming. The man who left her had no idea what he had just walked away from, but he was about to find out. And before Claire could even process what had landed in her lap, someone else was already moving to take it from her. Someone she had trusted, and someone she never would have suspected. Stay with me, because this story is so much bigger than it first appears. Before we go back to the beginning, and we will go all the way back, because you need to understand who Claire was before any of this happened to truly understand the weight of what she survived. There are 3 questions sitting at the center of this story, and I want you to hold all 3 of them in your mind as everything unfolds. How they are the questions that investigators would later ask, that attorneys would argue over in courtrooms, that Claire herself, in quiet moments in the months that followed, would turn over and over in her mind, trying to find the answers. The first question is the one that seems simple, but is not. Why did Marcus Webb really leave? He told people afterward that the marriage had deteriorated, that they had grown apart, that he was unhappy and had been for a long time. And some of that may even be true. But the timeline of what he did, the methodical, careful, precisely timed way he moved money before he walked out, the legal action he filed within 72 hours of a news story breaking about the Whitfield estate, raises a question that is very hard to dismiss. Was this abandonment? Or was this strategy? Was this a man leaving a marriage that had failed him? Or a man executing a plan he had been building for months? But the second question is darker and more complicated. Who else knew about the inheritance before Claire did? Eleanor Whitfield was an intensely private woman. She had spent 60 years building a fortune in near-total silence, without press coverage, without a public profile, without anyone outside of a small circle of attorneys and financial managers understanding the true scale of what she had accumulated. But in a fortune of $10.2 billion, there are always people circling. what there are always people watching. And as we will come to learn, at least one person in Claire's immediate world knew far more than they ever said. And the third question, the one that I think will stay with you long after this video ends, is simply this. After everything Marcus did, after everything Claire endured, did she get the justice she deserved? The answer is more complicated than you might expect. And the final chapter of this story is one that nobody, not even Claire's own legal team, Chatuyus, saw coming. Claire Ann Whitfield was born in the summer of 1989 in Summerville, South Carolina, the youngest of two daughters born to Patricia and Gerald Whitfield. Gerald ran a modest hardware store on the edge of town. Patricia taught third grade at the local elementary school for 22 years. They were not wealthy people. They were not connected people. But they were steady, and they were loving, and they raised their daughters with the kind of quiet dignity that does not advertise itself but is impossible to miss once you see it. Claire grew up understanding that money was not something you talked about at the dinner table. Not because they had it, but because they did not, and because her parents believed that a person's worth had absolutely nothing to do with what was in their bank account. What Claire did have was her grandmother. Eleanor May Whitfield, her father Gerald's mother, was a woman of a particular kind of Southern grace that has become increasingly rare. She was 91 years old when she died, and in those 91 years, she had seen things that most people only read about in history books. She had married young, buried her husband young, raised her son Gerald largely alone, and spent the subsequent decades doing something that almost nobody around her understood or paid much attention to. She had been quietly, methodically, and with extraordinary patience, building. Land investments in the early 1960s, when South Carolina property was deeply undervalued. A series of commercial holdings that she managed through a law firm with strict confidentiality agreements. Long-term stock positions that she held for decades, while everyone around her was chasing short-term gains. Eleanor did not discuss her finances with her family. She did not discuss them with anyone. And by the time she died at 91, what she had built in 60 years of silence was a private estate valued at approximately $10.2 billion. Claire did not know this. Gerald did not know this. Patricia did not know this. The family knew Eleanor was comfortable. She owned her home outright. She never struggled. She paid for Claire's college tuition without being asked and without making a production of it. But comfortable was the word they used. Comfortable. They had no frame of reference for what she had actually accumulated, because Eleanor had given them none. She attended Sunday dinners. She baked biscuits. She called Claire on every birthday without fail, and in those phone calls, she listened more than she spoke. And she asked the kinds of specific questions about Claire's life that made Claire feel, from the time she was a small girl, that she was the most important person in any room Eleanor Whitfield chose to walk into. Claire was 26 years old and working as a patient advocate at a hospital in Columbia when she met Marcus Webb. He was finishing a graduate degree in finance at the University of South Carolina. 30 years old, sharp-looking, with the particular kind of confident ease that some men carry into every room they enter. The kind that makes you feel like something interesting is about to happen. He had grown up in Charlotte, North Carolina, the only child of a commercial real estate developer who had done reasonably well for himself before a series of bad investments in 2008 had quietly reduced the family's circumstances. Marcus had watched his father lose money and lose face at the same time. And somewhere in that watching, he had decided that he would never be in that position, that he would always be ahead of the situation, that he would always know exactly where the exits were before he needed to use them. Claire did not know any of this when she met him at a fundraising dinner for the hospital where she worked. She knew that he was charming. She knew that he looked directly at her when she spoke, which was not something all men did. Oh, she knew that within 2 weeks of that first meeting, he had called her 3 times, sent flowers once, and arranged a dinner at a restaurant that was considerably nicer than anything she had ever been taken to. She was not a naive woman, but she was a warm one. And Marcus Webb, in those early months, was very good at finding the warmth in people and reflecting it back to them in a way that felt like recognition. They dated for 18 months. He proposed on a trip to Savannah, Georgia, on a balcony overlooking the river at dusk, with a ring that he told her had been custom-made and that had cost him more than he could reasonably afford, which she later came to understand was true in ways she had not initially registered. They married in a small ceremony in Somerville, with Patricia and Gerald and Eleanor in the front row, and a reception dinner at a local inn that Eleanor quietly paid for without telling anyone she had done so. Claire wore a vintage lace gown that had belonged to Patricia's mother. Marcus wore a charcoal suit and a smile that his best man would later describe, in a conversation that took place well after the marriage had ended, as the smile of a man who has just won something. It would take Claire several more years to understand what that meant. But the people who knew Marcus, the ones who had known him before Claire, the ones who had watched him operate in the years before they met, some of them understood it immediately, and none of them said a word. The first 2 years of the marriage were good, or at least they appeared to be. Marcus took a position at a mid-sized investment firm in Columbia. Claire continued her work at the hospital and began taking evening classes toward a master's degree in healthcare administration. They bought a used car together. They talked about eventually buying a house. And they had Sunday dinners at Patricia and Gerald's. And Eleanor would sometimes drive up from Charleston and sit at the table and watch Claire with an expression that Claire could never quite read. Something between pride and a kind of careful, quiet alertness, as if Eleanor was watching for something that she hoped would not appear. The cracks, when they came slowly and then all at once. Marcus's investment firm restructured in the 3rd year of their marriage, and his position was eliminated in a round of layoffs that he handled, on the surface, with grace, but that quietly recalibrated something inside him. He found another position within 3 months, but at a smaller firm, at a lower salary, with less status attached to it than the job he had lost. He did not discuss this with Claire in any meaningful way. When she asked how he was feeling about the change, he said he was fine. When she asked if they needed to adjust their budget, he said no. When she reached for his hand in the evenings, he was present enough to take it, but absent enough that she began to notice the difference between a hand that holds you and a hand that simply does not pull away. She told her mother, once, that she sometimes felt like she was living with a person who was performing the idea of being present without actually being there. Patricia listened carefully and then said something that Claire would remember later with an ache. She said, "Sweetheart, I pay attention to what a person does when things do not go their way. That is the truest version of who they are." Claire nodded and filed it away, and told herself that Marcus was under stress, and that marriages required patience, and that the difficulty of the moment did not define the whole. She was not wrong about any of that. She was just applying it to the wrong situation. It was in the spring of their 4th year of marriage that Claire discovered she was pregnant, and it was unexpected. They had discussed children in a general way, but had not been actively trying. She sat in the bathroom of their apartment for 20 minutes after seeing the result on the test. Not quite afraid, not quite joyful, but something in between the two. Something that felt like standing at the edge of a very significant threshold. When she told Marcus that evening, he smiled. He said all the right things. He opened a bottle of wine, poured himself a glass, and poured her a sparkling water, and he said that this was wonderful news, and that he was going to be a great father, and that everything was going to be fine. And Claire looked at his face and saw something that she could not name at the time, but that she would name later, in the long quiet of understanding that comes after a thing has already happened. She saw a man running through calculations. She saw a man deciding something. She just did not yet know what he was deciding. Before we get to the morning Marcus left, I need to tell you about the 23 days that came before it. Because that morning did not arrive out of nowhere. It was the visible surface of something that had been moving underneath the water for a long time. And when you understand exactly what Marcus had been doing in the weeks prior to walking out that door, the act of leaving stops looking like the impulsive decision of a man in emotional distress and starts looking like the final move in a sequence that had been planned with considerable care. The joint bank account that Claire and Marcus shared had, at its highest point during their marriage, held just over $42,000. It was their emergency fund, their safety net, the money they had saved together over 4 years of 2 incomes and careful spending. That Claire had always been the more diligent saver of the two. She had contributed the larger share of it. She checked the account periodically, but not obsessively, once or twice a week, the way people do when they trust the person they share their life with and have no particular reason to be looking for trouble. What she did not know was that, beginning 23 days before he left, Marcus had been moving money out of that account in a pattern that was clearly deliberate. Not in large, flagrant withdrawals that would trigger an alert. In incremental transfers, each one carefully calibrated to fall just below the threshold at which their bank's fraud detection system would flag unusual activity. $2,000 here, $1,500 there. Small enough, individually, to look like ordinary spending. Consistent enough, in aggregate, to drain $41,800 over 23 days. When Marcus walked out of their apartment on that Friday morning, there was less than $200 left in the account they had built together. By the time Claire checked it 2 hours later, he had transferred the remainder as well. He had done this while sleeping in the same bed as her, while sitting across from her at dinner. While going through the motions of a marriage he had already decided to end, counting down days on a calendar she could not see. The week before he left, Claire would later tell close friends, "I had a particular quality of wrongness that she could feel but could not locate." Marcus was not unkind to her during that week. He was not cold or obviously distant. He was, in fact, almost too even, too composed, too measured, the way a person sometimes becomes when they have made a decision, and the act of having made it has brought them a certain relief. She noticed that he seemed to be sleeping better than he had in months. She thought it meant things were improving. She thought the weight he had been carrying was beginning to lift. She was right about the weight lifting. She was wrong about the reason. She had a doctor's appointment on the Thursday before he left, a routine prenatal checkup at which everything was confirmed to be progressing normally. The baby was healthy. Claire was healthy. The doctor said she was doing everything right. So she came home that afternoon, feeling the particular quiet happiness of a woman who has been told that the life she is carrying is safe and strong. And she made dinner, and Marcus sat across from her and ate it. And they talked about something ordinary. A show they had both been watching, a neighbor's renovation project. And nothing in that conversation announced itself as a last conversation. Nothing in that meal announced itself as a last meal together. It was just Thursday, and then it was Friday. Claire has described the morning Marcus left so many times now, in so many different contexts, that the details have taken on the clarity of something that has been turned over and examined from every angle. She woke early, as she had been waking for weeks because of the pregnancy, unable to find a comfortable position after about 5 in the morning. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen window and watched the neighborhood coming to life in the early light. She was thinking about her grandmother. Eleanor had been calling less frequently over the past few weeks, and Claire had been meaning to drive down to Charleston to check on her, and she had been putting it off because of the pregnancy and the fatigue and the 100 small logistical complications of her daily life. She was sitting at that window, thinking about Eleanor, when she heard Marcus moving through the bedroom behind her. She assumed he was getting ready for work, and she turned to ask if he wanted coffee. And she saw the suitcase. Not the large one they used for vacations, the carry-on, the one he took on business trips. She said, later, that her first thought was that he had forgotten to mention a work trip, that her mind, in those first 2 seconds, worked very hard to find the most ordinary explanation for what she was seeing. Because the most ordinary explanation was the one that did not require her world to change. And then she looked at his face. And then she understood that there was no work trip. He said 7 words. 7 words to a woman who was 7 months pregnant with his child, standing in the kitchen of the home they had shared for 4 years, holding a cup of tea. He said, "I cannot do this anymore." She set the cup down very carefully on the counter. She asked him what he meant. He said, "You know what I mean, Claire." She asked him to please tell her what was happening. He picked up the suitcase. He walked to the door. He opened it. Yet he did not slam it. He pulled it closed behind him with the quiet, deliberate click of a person who has rehearsed this moment and decided that controlled is better than dramatic. And then he was gone. 4 minutes, maybe 5. The entire ending of 4 years of marriage conducted in less time than it takes to make a pot of coffee. Claire stood in the kitchen for a long time after the door closed. She stood there until her tea was cold and the street outside was fully awake, and a child somewhere in the building was laughing about something. That particular high, bright sound of a child who has not yet learned what it means for a room to be too quiet. She did not cry immediately. She said later that the shock of it was so complete that her body did not know what category to put it in, whether it was grief or fear or rage or disbelief, or some combination of all 4 that had not yet sorted itself into anything her nervous system could process. She stood in the kitchen. She breathed. And then she picked up her phone and called her mother. Patricia Whitfield drove 3 hours from Somerville without stopping. She arrived to find Claire still in the kitchen, still in the clothes she had been wearing when Marcus left, sitting very still in the way that people sometimes sit when they are holding themselves together through sheer physical concentration. Patricia did not ask a lot of questions. She made food. She sat with her daughter. She held her hand. She was a 3rd-grade teacher who had spent 22 years learning how to be present for people in distress, and she applied every bit of that skill to the next 18 hours of her daughter's life. When Claire finally slept, Patricia sat in the small living room of that apartment and looked at the empty spaces where Marcus's things had been, and she made a phone call of her own. The bank account discovery came the next morning. Claire woke early again, the baby moving inside her with that particular insistence of a child who does not understand that its mother needs rest, and she checked her phone out of habit, and she saw the bank balance. She read it 3 times. She opened the transaction history. She scrolled back 23 days and watched the pattern reveal itself in numbers. The withdrawals, so carefully spaced, so deliberately sized, the entire architecture of a calculated exit laid out in a list of dates and dollar amounts. She showed it to Patricia without saying a word. Patricia looked at it for a long time, and then she said, very quietly, that they needed to call a lawyer. What neither of them knew in that moment, Chukwu, was that 11 blocks away, at the front door of their building, a courier from the law firm of Hargrove, Pemberton, and Associates in Charleston had just left a delivery notice for an envelope addressed to Claire Whitfield. He had already tried once the day before and gotten no answer. He left the notice on the door and walked back to his van. The envelope, containing a letter that would fundamentally alter every calculation anyone in this story had been making, waited on the doorstep for 36 hours, while Claire sat inside in the worst hours of her life, with no idea it was there. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our videos. Now, let's continue. It was 9 days after Marcus left that Claire finally noticed the slip of paper that had been tucked against the doorframe. She had been in the apartment almost continuously for over a week. Her mother had stayed for 6 days before returning to Somerville for a commitment she could not cancel, and Claire had been managing the particular exhaustion of early grief overlaid on late pregnancy, which is a combination that leaves very little energy for noticing things on doorframes. She had stepped over that notice at least 8 times. On the 9th day, walking back from the mailbox, she finally picked it up. The slip directed her to retrieve a package from the courier's local office. She drove herself there the following morning, a Tuesday, and came home with a white envelope from Hargrove, Pemberton, and Associates, attorneys at law, with a Charleston, South Carolina address and a return label that meant nothing to her. She set it on the kitchen table. She made herself breakfast. She sat down and opened it. The letter was 2 pages long. She read the first paragraph. She set it down. She picked it up and read the first paragraph again. She set it down a second time and walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face. She looked at herself in the mirror for what she later described as a very long time, and then she walked back to the kitchen and read the rest of it. Eleanor May Whitfield had passed away 3 weeks earlier, at her home in Charleston, peacefully and in her sleep, at the age of 91. The family had been notified of her death. What they had not been notified of, what Eleanor's attorneys had been instructed to withhold until the estate was fully processed and verified, was the precise nature of what Eleanor had left behind. The letter from Hargrove, Pemberton, and Associates informed Claire, in the careful and precise language of estate law, that she was the sole named beneficiary in the last will and testament of Eleanor May Whitfield, and that the preliminary valuation of the estate, including real property, investment portfolios, trust instruments, and liquid assets, stood at approximately $10.2 billion. Claire sat at that kitchen table for a very long time. She was 8.5 months pregnant. She had $47 in a savings account she had almost forgotten existed. But her husband of 4 years had left 9 days earlier and taken everything from their shared account. And her grandmother, the woman who called her every birthday, who baked biscuits on Sunday mornings, who had paid for her college tuition without making a production of it, who had driven to Columbia for every small milestone of Claire's adult life, carrying containers of food and a particular expression of quiet, attentive love, had left her everything. $10 billion. Everything. She called her father Gerald before she called anyone else. She read him the letter over the phone. There was a very long silence on his end, and then Gerald Whitfield, hardware store owner, a man who did not cry easily and had not cried in front of his daughters since Patricia's mother died, began to cry. Not because of the money, because he understood, hearing that letter read aloud, that his mother had been carrying something enormous for decades, had carried it quietly and alone and without asking for recognition or credit. and had given it, in the end, to the person she trusted most. He understood that Eleanor had seen something in Claire that she had protected and prepared for, and ultimately believed in enough to leave the entire architecture of her life's work to. And Gerald Whitfield wept at his kitchen table in Summerville, South Carolina, because his mother was gone, and because she had, in her going, said something to his daughter that could not be unsaid. The legal complexity of what followed was considerable, and we will get to it. But first, you need to understand how the story became public. Because Eleanor had been clear in her instructions, absolute discretion, no announcements, the beneficiary to be notified privately. What Eleanor could not have anticipated was that an inheritance of this size, moving through the South Carolina probate process, even under the strictest confidentiality, would develop the particular kind of institutional leakage that very large numbers tend to produce. A clerk, a phone call, a source within the firm speaking to a contact at a financial publication. The story appeared in a Charleston business journal 7 days after Claire received her letter, and within 48 hours it had been picked up by national outlets. Claire's name and photograph were everywhere. And somewhere in Charlotte, North Carolina, Marcus Webb picked up his phone, opened a news alert, and read his wife's name in a headline he had not been expecting. And something shifted in him. And within 72 hours, he had made a phone call to a family law attorney. The contest for the will came first, before Marcus's legal maneuvering, and it came from a direction that added a layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Eleanor Whitfield had a nephew by marriage, a man named Richard Harlow, 67 years old, a retired financial manager who had spent the last decade of his working life managing one of Eleanor's investment portfolios under a contracted arrangement. Richard had managed Eleanor's money. He had attended family gatherings over the years. He had believed, on the basis of conversations he claimed to have had with Eleanor in the final years of her life, and that he was going to be remembered in her will with something substantial. He had, in fact, spoken to colleagues about his expected inheritance in terms that suggested he had treated it as a financial planning assumption. What he received was nothing. Eleanor's final will, which had been drafted and notarized 3 years before her death, left her entire estate to Claire, with specific bequests to several charitable organizations and a modest sum to Patricia and Gerald. Diane gave Richard Harlow exactly 0. He filed his challenge within 10 days of Eleanor's death, before Claire had even received her letter, before anyone outside the legal team knew the full scope of the estate. His attorneys argued that the will had been drafted during a period of cognitive decline, that Eleanor had not fully understood what she was signing, and that the document should therefore be considered invalid. And the challenge was accompanied by affidavits from 2 physicians whom Richard had retained for the specific purpose of providing these opinions, and it was filed with considerable noise in the Charleston probate court. Claire was 3 weeks away from her due date when she learned about Richard's challenge. She was managing the shock of the inheritance, the rawness of Marcus's departure, the physical exhaustion of late pregnancy, and now a legal fight over whether her grandmother had been of sound mind when she decided to leave Claire everything. She has described that period as the most disorienting of her life, not because any single thing was unsurmountable, but because the combination of all of them together, landing in such rapid succession, made the ground feel like it was constantly shifting beneath her. Her attorney, a woman named Margaret Osei, who had worked with Eleanor for 31 years and who Claire was meeting for the first time, sat across from her in an office in Charleston and said very calmly, "Your grandmother prepared for this. I want you to understand that she prepared for exactly this. Trust the preparation." Margaret Osei was 63 years old, a Charleston native, a graduate of Howard University Law School, and a woman who had spent 31 years as Eleanor Whitfield's most trusted professional confidant. She knew things about Eleanor's estate planning that no other living person knew. She knew the care with which Eleanor had arranged every element of the will and its supporting documentation. And she knew something that she had not yet shared with Claire. Something that Eleanor had specifically asked her to hold back until it became necessary. A document written in Eleanor's own hand, placed in a sealed envelope in the firm's safe 3 years before Eleanor's death. Margaret had been instructed to open it only if someone contested the will or if Claire faced a legal challenge related to her marriage. Both conditions had now been met, and what was in that envelope was about to change everything, including, most significantly, everything Claire thought she understood about the marriage that had just ended. Marcus Webb's legal claim, and when it landed in Claire's attorney's office, was built on a narrow but not entirely frivolous argument. South Carolina is an equitable distribution state, meaning that in a divorce, marital assets are divided in a way that a court determines to be fair, which does not necessarily mean equal, but which does mean that both parties can make arguments about what they are entitled to. Well, Marcus's attorneys argued that because Eleanor died while Marcus and Claire were still legally married, the divorce had not yet been filed when Eleanor passed, and had not been finalized when the inheritance became public. There was a reasonable argument that the inheritance constituted a marital asset subject to equitable distribution. They were careful and strategic in how they framed this. They did not say Marcus deserved half. They said he deserved consideration. And they said the court should look carefully at the question of when the marital estate crystallized. Legal commentators who covered the case said it was a genuinely interesting question from a purely academic standpoint, and that in a different set of circumstances, with a different judge and different facts, it might have had some traction. But the facts in this case were not neutral. The facts in this case included 23 days of systematic account drainage. And the facts included a man who had left his pregnant wife with $47 and then filed a legal claim on her inheritance within 72 hours of a newspaper story. And the facts included something that Margaret Osey's team uncovered in the process of preparing Claire's defense, something that Marcus had never disclosed during the marriage, and that would prove to be the most consequential discovery in the entire legal proceedings. He had 2 additional financial accounts, and neither had ever appeared on any document Marcus had shared with Claire. One was an investment account opened in his name alone in the 4th month of their marriage. The other was a savings vehicle structured specifically to shelter assets from marital estate claims in a divorce proceeding. Both had been funded steadily throughout the marriage. Both were now, combined, worth just over $300,000. Money accumulated during the years of their marriage. Money that should have been visible and disclosed, money that had been deliberately hidden. Claire's legal team did not discover this through luck. They discovered it through the kind of methodical financial forensics that Eleanor's estate law firm had the resources and the inclination to pursue thoroughly. And when the pattern of those hidden accounts was set alongside the pattern of the joint account drainage in the weeks before Marcus left, what emerged was a picture that was very difficult to look at and very difficult to dismiss. This had not been a man in emotional distress making impulsive decisions. This had been, the attorneys would later argue, a long-running pattern of financial deception that constituted economic abuse within the marriage. Eleanor knew. She had always known, and she had prepared accordingly. For Margaret Osey placed the sealed envelope on the conference table between herself and Claire on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, 7 weeks after Marcus had left, and 2 weeks before Claire's due date. The envelope was made of heavy cream-colored stationery, the kind that Eleanor favored, with Claire's name written on the front in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting. Upright, deliberate, the letters of a woman who had always known exactly what she wanted to say. Margaret said, Your grandmother left instructions that this was only to be opened if specific circumstances arose. Those circumstances have arisen. Claire picked up the envelope. She held it for a moment without opening it, and then she carefully broke the seal. Eleanor May Whitfield had written the letter inside 14 months after Claire and Marcus's wedding, which meant she had written it within a year of the marriage, which meant she had been watching, assessing, paying attention, and reaching conclusions in the quiet way she did everything, without announcing them, without confronting anyone, without creating drama, almost from the very beginning. The letter was 4 pages long, written in Eleanor's own hand. It began with a description of a conversation Eleanor said she had observed between Marcus and a man she did not recognize at a social gathering in Columbia, approximately 3 months after the wedding. She had gone to use the restroom, she wrote, and she had passed an alcove where Marcus was standing with his back to her, speaking quietly into a phone. She had not intended to overhear, but she had been close enough to hear him say, with a precision that she had memorized and written down the same evening, "It is more complicated than I expected, but the access is real, and it is significant. I just need more time to confirm the full picture." And then she had walked past, and Marcus had not seen her. And she had spent the next several weeks doing something that Eleanor described in the letter as due diligence of a personal nature. What Eleanor had done in the months following that overheard conversation was hire a private investigator, a quiet, discreet professional based out of Greenville who specialized in what Eleanor described as character assessments for estate planning purposes. The investigator had looked into Marcus Webb's financial history, his professional background, and, most significantly, his conduct in the relationships that had preceded his marriage to Claire. What the investigator found was not criminal. It was not even, in any single instance, definitively damning. But the pattern it revealed, documented across several years and several relationships, was of a man who had consistently positioned himself in proximity to women of greater financial resources than his own, and who had, in each case, extracted what he could before moving on. Eleanor wrote, "I do not write this to cause you pain. I write it because I love you more than anything in this world, and because I have spent 90 years watching what happens when a woman is not protected. I have made arrangements. If I am right about him, those arrangements will be what stands between you and a very difficult situation. If I am wrong, you will simply have inherited what was always going to be yours, and you will never need to know any of this existed." Claire sat with the letter for a long time after she finished reading it. Margaret did not speak. The two of them simply sat in that conference room in Charleston, with the late autumn light coming through the windows, and Claire read it a second time, more slowly, and then she folded it carefully and held it in both hands. She said, very quietly, that she needed a minute. Margaret left the room, and Claire sat alone with her grandmother's words and with the understanding, enormous, settling over her all at once, that Eleanor had been watching over her in a way she had never known about, from a distance, in silence, without asking for acknowledgement or gratitude. It was needed. And Eleanor, in her preparation, had done far more than write a letter. The private investigator's full report was attached. An additional dossier of financial documentation was attached. And a third document, one that Margaret explained carefully to Claire in the conversation that followed, outlined the specific legal structure through which Eleanor had arranged Claire's inheritance to be protected from exactly the kind of marital asset claim that Marcus was currently attempting to make. Eleanor had consulted with estate attorneys 3 years before her death about the precise question of whether a post-marital inheritance left to a named individual could be isolated from a marital estate in the event of a divorce. The answer, her attorneys had determined, was yes, but only if the structure was properly arranged in advance. Eleanor had arranged it properly, down to the last detail. Richard Harlow's challenge to the will collapsed in February of the following year. Margaret presented the competency documentation, the 6 monthly cognitive assessments Eleanor had commissioned starting 4 years before her death, specifically to create a legal record that could defeat any future challenge based on mental incapacity. She presented the 3 separate video recordings Eleanor had made of herself dictating her final wishes, filmed across an 18-month period, each one clear and specific, and entirely composed. She presented letters Eleanor had written to her attorneys at the time of each amendment to the will, explaining her reasoning in detail. Richard's attorneys looked at this documentation and recognized that they had built their case on a foundation that did not exist. Richard withdrew the challenge on a Tuesday in February without issuing a public statement. The estate was confirmed in its entirety as Claire's. Marcus's legal claim took longer to resolve, but its resolution was, in some ways, more comprehensive. The investigation into his hidden financial accounts, which his attorneys had not anticipated Claire's team pursuing with such thoroughness, fundamentally altered the nature of the proceedings. Instead of Marcus negotiating from a position of legal leverage, he found himself negotiating from a position of significant legal exposure. The systematic draining of the joint account, combined with the hidden accounts maintained throughout the marriage, met the South Carolina legal definition of marital waste, the deliberate dissipation of marital assets, and opened the door to claims that went well beyond the divorce itself. A criminal fraud investigation was opened, not at Claire's initiative, at the initiative of investigators who had been presented with the financial evidence and determined that it warranted examination. Marcus Webb, who had walked out of his pregnant wife's apartment with $41,000 that was not solely his to take, was now the subject of a criminal inquiry, as well as a civil one. The man who had come back for the money was spending his money on attorneys to keep himself out of a criminal courtroom. On March the 14th, in the middle of everything, the legal proceedings, the news coverage, the constant motion of attorneys and investigators and financial advisors and journalists requesting comment, Claire Whitfield gave birth to a daughter. She was 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with dark eyes and a full head of hair, and the particular expression of absolute certainty that newborns sometimes carry, as if they have arrived with a clear sense of purpose and are simply waiting for the world to arrange itself around them. Claire named her Eleanor, and she held her in that hospital room in Columbia with Patricia on one side and her college friend Sandra on the other, and she looked at her daughter's face for a long time without speaking. And then she said, quietly, to no one in particular, "She would have loved you so much." The legal proceedings concluded over the following 8 months. The divorce was finalized. Marcus received nothing from the Whitfield estate. The legal structure Eleanor had put in place held precisely as designed. And the marital asset argument his attorneys had advanced was rejected. He was ordered to repay the money drained from the joint account, with interest, as part of the divorce settlement. The criminal fraud investigation remained open for 14 months before prosecutors determined, after extensive review, that while Marcus's conduct had been financially abusive and morally indefensible, and the specific evidence required to support a criminal fraud conviction under South Carolina statute at the threshold the district attorney's office required, was not fully sufficient to proceed to trial. The investigation was closed without charges. A great many people, when they learned of this outcome, felt that justice had not been fully served, that a man who had spent years carefully positioning himself to profit from a marriage, who had systematically drained a shared account while his pregnant wife was sleeping in the same bed, who had filed a legal claim on her inherited fortune within 72 hours of a news story, deserved to face something more significant than a civil repayment order. Claire herself, when asked about it in a rare interview she gave more than a year after the divorce was finalized, was quiet for a long moment before she answered. And then she said, "I spent a lot of time thinking about what Marcus deserved. And then I decided that what I wanted to spend my time thinking about was what Eleanor built and what I was going to do with it. Those are not the same question, and only one of them is mine to answer." The Eleanor Whitfield Foundation was incorporated 11 months after Claire received the letter from Hargrove, Pemberton and Associates. It was capitalized with an initial endowment of $200 million drawn from the estate. Its founding board included Margaret Osey, who Claire asked to serve as its first legal counsel, a maternal health physician from the Medical University of South Carolina, a financial abuse specialist who had spent 20 years working with women leaving economically coercive marriages, and Patricia Whitfield, who had retired from teaching and who showed up to every board meeting with a yellow legal pad and the same attentive expression she had once brought to her third-grade classroom. The Foundation's initial grant programs were directed at 3 areas. The first was maternal health services for women in South Carolina without adequate health care access, specifically targeting the gaps in prenatal and postnatal care that disproportionately affected women in rural and lower-income communities. And the statistics in this area were striking. South Carolina had, at the time of the Foundation's founding, one of the highest rates of maternal mortality in the country, with Black women facing outcomes significantly worse than white women, and with rural women across racial lines facing substantial access barriers that translated directly into preventable deaths and disabilities. And the Foundation committed $40 million over 5 years to a network of maternal health clinics and expanded services programs. The second area was legal aid for women in financially abusive marriages, a cause that required no explanation from Claire, and that she funded with a directness and specificity that reflected her own recent experience. The funding supported not just legal representation, but financial literacy education, to forensic accounting services for women who suspected hidden assets, and a rapid response grant program that could provide emergency financial resources to women who had been stripped of access to money by a partner and were navigating a crisis without resources. The program was modeled, in part, on what Claire had been through, on what it felt like to be left with $47 and a baby coming, and it was designed with the kind of specific, a practical knowledge that only comes from having lived the situation yourself. The third area was educational scholarships for first-generation college students from rural South Carolina communities. Eleanor Whitfield had grown up without wealth, in a rural community, at a time when the path to education for a woman of modest means was narrow and difficult and frequently obstructed. While she had navigated it through intelligence and determination, and a stubborn refusal to accept the limitations that the world tried to place on her. She had built a fortune without a famous family name or institutional advantage. And she had left it to a granddaughter who had been raised with the same values, not the value of money, but the value of education and self-determination, and the conviction that what a person can become is not determined by what they were born into. Though the scholarship program was named the Eleanor May Whitfield Scholarship, and its first cohort of 20 recipients was announced on what would have been Eleanor's 92nd birthday. Claire attended the announcement ceremony in Columbia, with baby Eleanor on her hip, and she stood at the podium and spoke for about 10 minutes about her grandmother, about the biscuits on Sunday mornings and the phone calls on every birthday, and the particular quality of attention that Eleanor brought to every conversation, the way she made you feel seen. She did not speak about the money. She did not speak about Marcus or the divorce or the legal proceedings or any of the things that had made her name recognizable. she spoke about Eleanor. And when she finished speaking, she said, she never talked about what she had built, because she never thought what she had built was the point. She thought the point was what you did with it. I am trying to understand what she meant. I am trying every day to be worthy of the question. She was 35 years old, standing in a room full of strangers who were about to have their lives changed by something a woman they would never meet had quietly built over 60 years. And she looked exactly like someone who has figured out what she is for. Marcus Webb relocated to a different city within a year of the divorce being finalized. He has not spoken publicly about Claire, the inheritance, the legal proceedings, or any element of the story that brought his name into public view. He works in a field adjacent to finance, at a considerably reduced level from where he had aspired to be when he enrolled in graduate school at 27. Whether he understands what he lost, and whether what he lost, in his own accounting, is the fortune or the woman, is not something anyone around him has been willing to characterize. Richard Harlow retired to a coastal community in North Carolina. He gives no indication of having found the outcome of the will contest anything other than deeply unfair. He has not spoken to Claire since the proceedings concluded. Patricia and Gerald Whitfield continue to live in Somerville. So Gerald still runs the hardware store, though he has hired additional staff and has more time now for the woodworking projects he has pursued as a hobby for 30 years. Patricia volunteers twice a week at the elementary school, where she spent 22 years teaching. She keeps a photograph of Eleanor on the mantelpiece in their living room, in the place it has always been. And when people ask about it, she says simply, "That is Eleanor. She was something else." And Eleanor herself, Eleanor May Whitfield, who grew up without wealth in a rural southern community, who outlasted a difficult marriage and a complicated century, and the condescension of people who did not understand that a quiet woman is not a small one. Eleanor is buried in a small cemetery outside Charleston, not far from the home where she spent the last 4 decades of her life. Her headstone is simple. Her name, the dates, and one line that she specified herself in a document she left with her attorneys. If you're enjoying the content and haven't subscribed yet, take a second now to hit that subscribe button and join the family. The end.